Thank you for being with us in Shaking the Tree over these last days. There are now 8 programme blocks to explore. So now we'll take a glimpse into the future and hear again from 2 powerful voices. The first is former nun in Kerala, India, Kochurani, now a lay theologian, who tells us how things could be in India if only the Catholic Church would grant women religious freedom of speech and protect them from clerical abuse. Finally, we hear again from Hille Haker, who is a German-born ethicist now at the Loyola University in Chicago. Here, she sums up for us the changes so badly needed in our church.
We all know that violations of human rights continue where hegemonic controls persist in the lives of the subjugated. In a country like India, the hegemonic grip of religion is strong on the consciousness of those who practice certain faith prescriptions. The gendered socialization of women makes them very susceptible to this reality, as they seem to internalize these hegemonic codes more than any other group of Christian faithful. Adding to this is clericalism that is pervasive in the Indian church. When priests are given an alter Christus status, abusive behavior on the part of clergy tends to get religious sanction, and consequently, violation of human rights persists. The consciousness factor is another key for unlocking the human rights question in the patriarchally inscribed social fabric of the Indian church. It may not be an exaggeration if I say that majority of Indian women religious function from a contradictory consciousness. While nuns as individuals may be conscientized to take a stand for their rights within or outside the system, collectively they may find it difficult to dispute the hegemony of those who hold religious power over them. Politically weak, they may not be in a position to disagree with the constructions of reality that these dominant groups produce and disseminate. And they may even conspire with the dominant religious culture to make the social order that oppress them appear natural and even morally justifiable. This is evident in the stand taken by the religious leadership in both the Hierarchical and Kochurani story. Claiming one's rights demands voicing concerns without fear. Voice is rightly termed as the collective locus of agency. In order to exercise agency, women religious need autonomy. But the way the vows are defined, particularly the vow of obedience, may not give them space for autonomy in thinking or action. The vow of obedience in its true spirit is meant to engage the religious in a mature process of discernment as adults. But the enslaving dependency prescriptions associated with an infantile application of this vow deny an average religious the freedom to exercise agency. Those who dare to think critically and voice their concerns get alienated, and in the bargain, many prefer to push ecclesiastical offences under the carpet of piety and ritualism. The overprotective structures of religious life, uniformity in daily practices, starting with the dress code, ritualistic spiritual observances and apostolic activities which are merely replicating the beaten path, do not challenge an average woman religious to think outside the box. At this juncture, the question for our consideration would be, how do we make a breakthrough? Surely the expectation that women religious conform to the interests of ecclesiastical leaders is a universal feature, not something unique to the Indian setting. The Vatican investigation of women religious in the United States some years ago testified to this. The only difference is that the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, or the LCWR, of the United States took to their ground and invited the church authorities to dialogue with them as adults. In the early 1980s, the then 100,000 odd women religious in India were labeled a sleeping giant by Jessie Tellis Naik, one of the pioneers of feminist theologizing in this country. Though there have been many attempts over the past 4 decades to awaken this huge body of consecrated women from their sleep, barring exceptions as individuals and a few congregations, their slumber seems to continue. Given the state of political unconscious that is pervasive in the life of a great majority of Indian women religious, evolving a consciousness of rights becomes possible only by awakening critical thought, as that could help develop cracks in a system that is repressive. The Gramscian notion of critical consciousness can enable women religious to challenge the premises and practices of their religious culture, and in doing so confront the premises of self, reaping the social order and even reaping themselves. I find this happening in the lives of many who are resisting oppressive ideologies and exploitative systems of power. Developing a critical consciousness is risky, as it will surely rock the boat, and one could be thrown into the deep seas. Further, the transition from a contradictory to a critical consciousness is never a smooth or a linear process. One is sure to be confronted by the interplay between insight and blindness, resistance and collusion, the critical self and the ideological self, and this could be scary. Yet, in a repressive situation, enabling critical thinking is crucial, as that alone can lead to new signposts which facilitate a liberative breakthrough. To conclude, Jesus Christ was a liberator because he dared to ask critical questions to the corrupt religio-political leaders who kept the vulnerable humans captive with their oppressive and exploitative ideologies. Perhaps the need of the hour is that more women religious and laity take up the prophetic mission of Jesus and confront the ecclesiastical powers that are tainted by clergy sexual abuse, binding ideologies, and unjust practices. This I see as the challenge before all of us who are concerned about human rights in the Catholic Church. Thank you.
When one is broken, the body suffers. Let's pray for healing for one another. When one is broken, the body suffers. Let's pray for healing for one another. Let's pray.
Welcome back. By now we have heard the voices of thousands and thousands of victims and survivors of clerical, sexual, and spiritual abuse. Those who have listened have urged the Church to change. We have demanded changes, concrete, systemic, and structural. But have our cries been heard? We are dismayed about the fact there's still no transparency, there's still no commission that examines the roots of the clerical violence of sexual nature, let alone other forms of clerical abuse, such as emotional and spiritual sacramental abuse, and all forms of abuse of authority. Regarding clerical sexual violence, there are only tiny legal changes of the canon law addressing clerics and their duties. Until 2021, canon law saw the transgression as a sin against chastity, namely through adultery. Moreover, it addressed only violence against minors. Canon 1395, paragraph 2 said, "A cleric who in another way has committed an offense against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue, if the delict was committed by force or threats or publicly or with a minor below the age of 16 years, is to be punished with the just penalties, not excluding dismissal from the clerical state if the case so warrants." Now, the new text has deleted the clause of minors, thus allowing for the inclusion of adults. But it is still not seen as a crime against the dignity and integrity of another person, but rather as the problem of the integrity of the priest. So, since 2021, Canon Law 1395, paragraph 2 reads, "A cleric who has offended in other ways against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue, if the offense was committed in public, is to be punished with just penalties, not excluding dismissal from the clerical state if the case so warrants." The reform, if one wants to call it this, is a third paragraph that has been added. Paragraph 3, "A cleric who by force, threat, or abuse of his authority commits an offense against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue, or forces someone to perform or submit to sexual acts, is to be punished with the same penalty as in paragraph 2. We are told that we should acknowledge that this is progress. We are told that victims and survivors of sexual abuse are now recognized in canon law, and that sexual violence by clergy is no longer exclusively regarded as an offense against the sixth commandment, although it still is that, but as a coercive act. But the formulation in paragraph 3, namely to force someone to perform or submit to sexual acts, still has no word for the victims, is abstract. Canon law only knows a cleric who coerces someone. It still does not name that the violence of sexual nature, as other forms of violence too, may destroy a person's life, identity, and integrity. Canon law may presuppose all that, but the rationale is still not centered on the harm done to victims of abuse. The statements by bishops mostly center on this legal issue of guilt and punishment, as well as compensation for victims. At the beginning of the millennium, bishops and even popes asked for forgiveness, and they appeared to be frustrated when this was not granted by the victims who were still addressed in the plural. How often did we hear that the church has understood that it needs to listen? But the leaders said this abstractly, with victims being depersonalized. That is why many of us do not want to be called the victims. We want to be called by our biblical names: Marie, Maria, Mary, Elizabeth, Peter, Pietro, Paul, Paolo, Judith, Thomas, Andrew. Many of these names faithfully given to us in remembrance of the disciples, followers, and saintly witnesses of Jesus Christ throughout the history of the Church. And we are Masego, Ligaya, Diego, Basea, Tomas, Nabila, Stanislav, or Pierre. What if the unbinding of the Spirit meant to center on the suffering and the agency of the victims' survivors? Let me ask this by way of 3 questions. First, what are your needs? The needs in the face of a stolen life will differ depending on one's story, one's context, and what we call sex, class, or race. It will differ in one's community and in another, and one's expectations will depend on the possibilities of all these particularities. But we all have in common our dignity, our vulnerability that makes us susceptible to clerical violence, exactly because it is pervasive in the Church, and our agency that resists the structural violence. We want to hear from those whose voices we need to hear most. We want you to guide us in the steps we are about to take. There are, however, some basic needs that must be met, and in part, these needs coincide with my second question. What are the responsibilities of the Church, of Church members, the clergy, the lay people, Of course, there's a financial need so that any victim of clerical violence can seek the help they need. Formation courses need to be financed, research programs established, but the responsibilities go far beyond these immediate needs. Any violence is a violation of human rights and not merely an offense against norms of chastity or the prohibition to adultery. That framing pushes the violence into the background and focuses on the sexual act itself only. But clerical abuse can take the form of spiritual and sacramental abuse of power. It also involves force, for example, emotional coercion and hierarchical abuse of power. Abuse of power entails what has been called epistemic injustice, the power to ignore the voices, the complaints, the rights of others as moral agents. Thus, we want to see clerical violence in the context of human rights violations and ask, third, what are our rights? As human beings, we have three kinds of rights. First, we have basic rights, in particular, the right to be protected, for instance, against violence. This is the task of states, and it is the reason why they have the power to govern, to punish, and to legislate. The Catholic Church, despite its own canon law that provides it with a governance structure for its own affairs, is also bound by the legal law of states and by international law. Insofar as it includes the basic human rights, the Church must follow through. Within its realm, its spaces, practices, and institutions, the Church must protect everybody against acts of violence and or abuse of power. When canon law states that forcing someone to perform sexual acts is an offense against the sixth commandment, this does not capture the human rights violation, or in other words, the crime of sexual violence, the violation of a person's physical and psychic integrity. In the case that a person has been harmed and abused by a cleric, the victim survivor and their family can demand that every measure is taken to prevent this from happening again. The measures of safeguarding to prevent violence to happen are necessary, but by no means are they sufficient. And they are not extraordinary, but basic means of protection and prevention of violence and abuse of power. Second, we have the right to be provided with the means to live a decent life. In the context of sexual violence committed in and by the Church, this means that victims and survivors and their families have a right to get whatever treatment they need to regain trust after having been harmed. Moreover, all members of the Church have the right to a spiritual life within the Church. It must not be restricted because of a particular relationship, because of gay marriage, divorce, or remarriage. All members have the right to be provided with a spiritual space within their church, and the right to spiritual advisors they can trust. We have the right to a church that is not exclusively occupied by clergymen when it comes to the sacraments, be it baptisms, Eucharists, confessions, or marriage. We have the right to experience the Spirit that breathes God's promise of life, all the more for those whose life has been damaged. The Church must provide any means possible to enable those who have been harmed to feel and be at home in the Church. Third, we have the right to be respected in our right to decide upon our own affairs, the Church's affairs, and in self-governance of the Church. With respect to the Church as institution, this points to the right to participation. Participation is a human right that requires to change the attitudes towards the laity. Participation goes beyond the right to receive the sacrament, the right to communion. Sadly, even this central symbol of our community with God is denied to those who are rendered unqualified to receive God's grace. What a shameful presumption. The right to participation is not only a right to receive God's presence through the sacraments, but also a right to be respected in our agency, power, and governance. Participation is indeed synodal power, the power to raise our voices and engage in the decisions the Church makes. But if this participation is not institutionalized at all levels, and if the difference between laity and clergy is still the decisive criterion for ultimately making decisions regarding the norms and laws of the Church, then the structural violence is not overcome. The danger that the Synod is only an ersatz, a substitution for change, is real. It can only be avoided if participation structures are established and the subsidiarity principle is applied. It says that those affairs that can be decided locally ought to be decided locally. From these three groups of rights, we can identify the obligation to protect us and our children, the obligation to provide us with the spaces and measures of a decent spiritual life, and the obligation to share in deliberations, governance, and administration of the Church as institution. Ultimately, however, no rights language, no norms, no laws, and no guidelines can substitute for the bond that brings a community of people together, that binds them in love, solidarity, and the remembrance of the God who became human, who knows that human lives are destroyed and stolen on a daily basis, who cries with the victims of violence, who promised that another world is possible and committed us to its coming, who gave us the gift of their Spirit as our companion throughout the history of the world, and the capability to speak, to tell our stories, to remember those who were lost and those who resisted, who gave us the capability to act and to hold each other accountable. This is a summons, a call, a responsibility. But it is also a reassurance, because when God created humans, this came with a promise of ever new beginnings.